Welcome to Social Dynamics, and I'm super excited today. You have been seeing us talking with people in person, and what I love about technology is the ability for us to be in different cities and different states and to be able to continue this conversation in social dynamics. And I'm welcoming my dear friend, Julianne Meyer, and welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm so good. I'm so glad you invited me on the show today. I always enjoy your company, and I love to share about spirit. So thank you for inviting me.
This is an absolutely great place for you to be. The platform is all about spiritual wisdom and practical things that we can use from the spiritual realm to be able to apply to our life in this moment to make a difference. And I would just love to hear from you. What's on your heart today that you would like to share about?
Sarah, that's a fantastic question. And I really feel that a lot of people tend to suffer with something called anguish. Ultimately, there's one problem, but what I focus on is helping people eradicate anguish.
Oh, that is so incredibly powerful, because I know that in my life, there have been moments and times where I have felt just that the stickiness. It's like a heavy oil that just seems to permeate, that's hard to wash off. So Julianne, let's start with the very, very basic place, my friend. What is your definition of anguish?
Thank you for asking that, because it's not necessarily Webster's version. How you described anguish is more along the lines of how I would. So for me, anguish obviously is uncomfortability as well as pain in your life, and it can happen emotionally, mentally, physically. But this in particular, how I use anguish is the inability to either make decisions or not have the ability to follow through on those decisions, and also not having clarity about what's best for you. And that's where that stickiness you were talking about comes in.
Oh, that is absolutely it. It's almost like that you feel that, oh, I can do this, and then you kind of get into the can I do this, and then it becomes slower and slower. And yeah, I think that sticky is the word for that. The other thought that I had was a little bit of the quicksand kind of a thing, right? You put your foot in it and you're like, oh, that has a way more pull to it than what I thought it would. It just looked like a little bit of sand there. Was a little bit wet, right? But yet there's more going on underneath the surface of that. So as you are talking about anguish, what are the main reasons that you have found that people come into this experience of anguish?
Well, Sarah, there are many reasons, but there are actually four main ones. And the top four are peer pressure, feelings of abandonment, feeling rejected, as well as being taken advantage of. So those are the top four.
I love that you have four, and I would love for us today just to start. Can we start a series today, Julianne?
I would be so delighted to do that with you, Sarah.
Wonderful. Well, let's just go ahead and start with that first one. Let's just go dive deep into the peer pressure one. Tell me a little bit more about what the correlation and life experiences that you have found between anguish and peer pressure, or peer pressure and anguish.
That is a really good question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because peer pressure isn't just for children. It's for adults as well. And we tend to forget that. We think of that as something we grow out of, but in fact, we grow into it, because the more we act in a certain way, it becomes a habit and we build neural pathways. And then it just becomes a part of how we're being. So peer pressure in general, it disables a person's ability to follow through with their own feelings and their decisions. Pretty straightforward. Bam, that's anguish right there.
Yes, that is so powerful. In fact, if you want to go back and just recap that again for us, because I think that that's something that my soul needs to hear again, please, friend.
Absolutely. So peer pressure disables a person's ability to follow through with their own thoughts and decisions. And it actually influences the subconscious programming of the human psyche, ultimately, as well as your human behavior. So it goes a lot deeper than just Mikey told me to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you talk about this peer pressure connecting in and impacting the subconscious levels, what is the source of anguish? Yes, there's the peer pressure part of it, but how are we getting to the source? Because you talked about eradicating, and I know that I have weeds in my garden outside. And I keep looking for the tap root, right? I want to get to the very, very base, because if I don't, if I leave part of it in there, there are some roots that just come right back. So I would love for you to share what the source of that anguish is.
Oh, I would definitely love to share about that, but I do want to go back a little bit further on peer pressure, because I want everyone to understand it a little bit more. So peer pressure actually makes you question everything. I could literally tell you 1 + 1 = 2, and you know that 1 + 1 = 2. Yet you're going to say, your brain is going to say, did I hear her right? Did she really say that? And that will cause you to ask again. Now, I understand that that's a very simplistic example. However, it really reiterates the point where even when you think you know something, you second guess yourself. And at that moment is exactly when you become frozen until someone that you're either afraid of, somebody that you admire, or somebody that you believe is better than you tells you what to do. So that's absolutely what it is. And it is literally, as I mentioned before, a subconscious programming. And then you only act from peer pressure at that point. So it's pretty crazy how that goes.
So I love how you talk about having the information, you have the facts in front of you. Your brain sees the facts, is able to make a rational decision with that information. And yet we wait for this huge gust of wind to happen through other people, through someone that we admire, somehow taking almost a push in the back to get us to move forward into a decision that we may know is already the right next best decision for us.
Exactly, but it's also not even the next best decision. It can be a bad one as well. That's where like abusive relationships come in. So let's say you're in a physically abusive relationship. All of a sudden, your body becomes wired that if you're having intimate relationship with your partner and they hit you, you can't have an orgasm until they hit you. So you're literally waiting until they hit you, and you're prodding that along so that you can have your orgasm. So it's not necessarily even a positive thing. It can be peer pressure to do the most negative drugs, alcohol, watching too much TV, eating too much sugar. And we end up completely off our own path because we're letting other people decide for us.
And that in itself is where the issue becomes, because we are no longer living in our authentic self. We are waiting for outside influences and forces then to just allow us to move. It's almost like we are in a boat that has a sail but nobody at the rudder, right? And just whichever way the wind is going to blow is going to be where the boat is going to go. And I believe that people on social dynamics who are listening in are people who have a rudder. They are people who want their boat to go someplace. They want their life to have a meaning. And so as you are sharing this with us about anguish in this first area of peer pressure, is there a source that you have found that has been something that you have noticed in conversations with other people, that you have learned from your own life experiences, that really comes down to that root of what this is about?
Yes, absolutely. And that is a beautiful question. And I'm so glad we circled back around to it, because it's ultimately the ultimate problem. There's really only one problem and I'm holding up 2 fingers. There's really only one problem that we as humans have. And that is when we identify with our ego self. So let me back up a little bit. There's 3 parts of us. There's our inner child, our ego, and our higher self. So our ego isn't necessarily a bad thing. Our ego is all of our different personalities and, different personas that we take on. So like being a mother or being a lawyer or being athletic, those are all personalities. The inner child is the I am. It is everything. It's the purity. It's before you add on all the personalities. So, and then obviously the higher self is the God self within you. So the way that we break it down is that you want to be able to, if all the problems occur when you're living from your ego as opposed to your higher self. So in order to live an integrated life and in order to have peace of mind, because that's what we all want ultimately, is we have to learn how to become inner child plus our ego and listen to our higher self. So it's a little bit of a process, but that's where the soul journey comes in. And that's something that we teach.
I would love to hear more about the soul journey. Have you been a student of the soul journey? What's your experience with that been, friend?
The soul journey has absolutely changed my life. I was a student of the soul journey, and now I'm actually a coach. And that's what I mean when I say we. I mean we as a collective. I have the honor and the privilege of helping people start on their very own soul journey. And the promise of the soul journey is that you will ultimately have a conversation with your sacred superconscious self. So what does that mean? That means that you are going to be able to quiet the ego down and connect with the higher self. It's that inner knowingness. Instead of going outside and listening to that peer pressure and listening to outside sources and things that don't really know, you are going to be able to connect with that inner child, that inner being, and your higher self, so that you can ultimately choose what is best for you. Because that's, as I mentioned before, that's where the anguish comes in. It's when we are disconnected from our higher self.
I'm loving how you're sharing this so clearly. The idea that we have an inner child, this innocent inner child. I had the privilege this last weekend of going and visiting a brand new baby in our extended family, and just seeing, it was all possibility, right? Everything was wrapped up into this being. It was absolute beauty and possibility. And I love that you talk about that being the inner child. And then that they're the ego, and the ego isn't necessarily bad, or is it? Because I'm thinking about personalities, and there's sometimes when I show up as a mom and I'm in a pretty good place, and there are other times that I show up as a mom and I am not in a good place, right? So there's some different energy that goes along in those different, same words, different people showing up.
No, absolutely. And here's the thing, like I mentioned before, the ego isn't bad. The ego is ultimately trying to protect you. It's either trying to protect you from something, avoid some sort of a pain, something along those lines. So what I'm saying is that it wants to it's afraid of losing something. The ego is afraid of losing something. And that's where it comes out, maybe in the not the most positive way. If you're mad at your child because they ran across the street, you're afraid they're going to get hurt. So that's where the ego comes in. It's not a bad thing, but it can cause you to act in ways that are not in your highest interest and not in your best self. It tricks you into thinking that you're doing the right thing when ultimately not so much. It's going to actually bring on the thing that you're afraid of the most.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. There is this one-to-one correlation about what I spend my mind thinking about and what I spend my time creating in my mind, whether it's for good or for evil. The thoughts, the soil is fertile in our mind center. And so whatever we choose to plant in there, it doesn't care. If you plant nightshade, which is going to be something that is going to cause people to be very sick if they eat it, or if you happen to plant something that's really healthy for people like green beans, the soil doesn't care, right? The soil just receives the seed and knows what to do with it. And it's the same thing with our thought process, the same thing with how we want to see things unfold in the future. If we choose to come into that space as being somebody who is allowing spirit to lead, that we are listening internally, having these inner conversations. And you mentioned a conversation with God, and I think about conversations as actually talking. So are you talking about talking to God, or communication comes in other ways as well, as written or as synchronicities, or what's your experience in your conversations with God?
That is a wonderful question, because it sounds kind of opaque when I say conversations with God, and the whole purpose is to make it practical and useful. So thank you for asking for a little bit more clarification on that. So conversations with God it can look a little bit different for each person. So sometimes it's that gut feeling, that inner knowingness, and you just know beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's kind of like when twins, they can feel the other one get hurt somewhere. They just know, and that's part of a conversation with God. And it's something that you actually can develop. It's meant for everyone. That's who we are. That is our higher self. That is who we truly are. And we tend to forget that when we're born. So the whole point of the conversations with God is to reconnect with our higher self. And that means that through meditation, for example, and that's one of the best ways to have the conversations with God is through meditation. You learn to quiet that monkey mind of yours, the ego mind that's telling you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and constantly judging about everything and everything. And like I said before, it comes from a place of wanting to protect you. It comes from a place of wanting to avoid some sort of a pain. That's where it comes from. But when you learn, and this is what we teach, is how to actually have that conversation. And the more you have these conversations, the more strong it gets, the better the connection is. And it does show up different ways for different people. I sometimes actually hear like a voice in my head, but the thing is with the conversations is it's energy. Everything is energy. And so how the energy gets to you and how you're able to receive it, the universe is going to use that. So some people hear it through music. Some people, see it through signs like feathers or pennies or, all sorts of things like that. But you will literally get to the point where you don't need all of those external things to have your own conversation. You will build up that inner ability to do it. And it just takes practice, but we teach you how to do that.
Oh, I absolutely love that. And Julianne, I would love to ask one more question today. As we've talked about anguish and reasons that people potentially feel anguish, you mentioned a really powerful word at the very beginning of this, the word eradicate. Is there a way for people to eradicate anguish?
There absolutely is. And as I mentioned, it's through conversations with God. And the reason why is because ultimately, as I mentioned before, we really only have one problem. And from that one problem, there comes two issues. Those two issues are dealing with unhappiness and sickness. And sickness can take on the form of physical, mental, or emotional. So your ego is trying to keep you from those things. Unfortunately, you end up having them because you're thinking from that level. But once you have a better understanding and you can connect to your higher self, who you truly are, not this little person that gets caught up in the day-to-day business of life, but the person who's focused on their bigger reason for being here, then you ultimately have less fear. And having that less fear eradicates the anguish because you have inner peace. They can't coexist. So that's literally how it's done. And it is possible because fear, anguish, all of these things, they're just challenges, and you can overcome any challenge.
Absolutely. And there is a difference between fear that you are holding your grandmother's hand and in a crosswalk and that there is a car that's not paying attention or the person driving the car isn't paying attention. That is a whole different kind of fear than the acronym for fear, false evidence appearing real. And there are some times that things show up in my life that absolutely masquerade to be something else energetically, things that they aren't. If I look at them and just have a conversation with them, realize that that's not at all what it looks like, but boy, the feelings are all there about it being something so much more, because it just finds all the masks, finds all the cloaks, and just shows up like this great big thing. And absolutely. So I loved how you had the summary for us of our time together. In Social Dynamics, we continue to have conversations with thought leaders, spiritual leaders, people who are on the cutting edge of taking ancient wisdom, spiritual wisdom, and finding ways to apply it anew to our lives today. And if you are enjoying these conversations, I encourage you to subscribe, because there are more conversations coming. And as you know, audience, that we will be having more conversations with Julianne, because this is the beginning of a series. So thank you so much.